If someone parks inside your garage without permission, closes the message with HOA authorized, and expects you to thank them for it, maybe they deserve exactly what they asked for. At 6:18 on a Thursday morning, I unlocked my front door carrying a gas station coffee that already tasted burnt and disappointment, stepped into my quiet suburban kitchen, and immediately knew something was wrong. Not because I heard anything. Quite the opposite. My house sounded too calm, too finished, the kind of silence that feels staged. I set my keys down and looked through the interior window facing the garage. The light was different. My garage door had narrow windows along the top panel, and every morning the sunrise cut through them in the same familiar pattern across the concrete floor. That morning, the light stopped halfway. Something was blocking it. I walked toward the mudroom door and hit the garage opener. Nothing happened. I pressed again. Motor hummed. Door didn't move. I frowned, opened the interior access door manually, and froze. Sitting inside my garage like it paid property taxes was a white Cadillac Escalade, parked perfectly centered. Engine off. Windows tinted. Driver gone. There was enough room on both sides to open doors. Whoever put it there didn't rush. They took their time. My workbench was pushed back 6 inches. My rolling stool sat crooked. One of my extension cords had been moved and looped over a shelf. Somebody had stood in my garage and arranged things. Then I saw the paper taped to the windshield. White printer paper. Bold black text. Temporary HOA overflow parking authorization. Underneath, smaller font. And used enclosed spaces may be utilized during community event periods to preserve neighborhood appearance. No signature. No actual bylaw reference. Just a neat little HOA logo in the corner. I stared at it for maybe 30 seconds before I laughed once. Not because it was funny, because sometimes your brain refuses to believe what your eyes are telling it. My name's Ethan Mercer. I'm 43 years old, electrical engineer, divorced 3 years, and generally not a dramatic person. I don't argue online. I don't yell at customer service. I read terms and conditions. I return shopping carts. And I especially don't enjoy neighborhood politics. That garage wasn't storage. It was an empty space. It was mine. My father's old tool chest sat against the back wall. My workbench. My compressor. The cabinet where I kept every socket organized because my dad used to say, if your tools are lost, your day is lost. That garage survived my divorce. It survived layoffs. It survived rebuilding my life one quiet weekend at a time. And now somebody parked inside it like they were claiming a beach chair. I already knew whose vehicle it was. Brenda Holloway, HOA president, 52, realtor, drives expensive SUVs and speaks in the tone of someone permanently explaining rules to children. The type of person who says community standards like she invented civilization. 3 months earlier, she'd sent me a warning because my garage door stayed open while I cleaned shelves. 2 months earlier, she suggested garages should serve visual consistency. 2 weeks ago, she asked during an HOA meeting whether residents should register enclosed storage usage. Everybody laughed. Apparently, she wasn't joking. I walked around the SUV slowly. No damage. No emergency. No reason. Then I noticed another detail. A text message. Unknown number. Sent at 11:14 p.m. Welcome to Cooperative Community Living. Vehicle will be removed after event week. Thank you for understanding. I read it twice. Took a sip of cold coffee. Looked at the garage door. Then at my calendar app. Then back at the Escalade. And suddenly I felt completely calm. No anger. No shouting. No police. Just one very simple thought. If she wanted access to my garage that badly, maybe she should enjoy all of it. I reached up, pressed the wall control, watched the garage door roll down with a smooth mechanical hum, listened to the lock engage, opened my phone, and booked myself a 14-day vacation. People always imagine revenge as something loud. My father used to say the opposite. If somebody crosses a line, do not stop them halfway. Let them show you exactly who they are first. I stood in my kitchen with my phone in my hand and looked at the confirmation email. For a 14-day stay outside Sedona, Arizona. Desert View. No refunds. I booked the cheapest direct flight leaving that afternoon and felt something I had not felt in months. Peace. Not because I wanted trouble. Because for once, I was not going to chase it. I was going to let it sit exactly where it parked itself. Before I left, I walked back into the garage one more time. The Escalade sat there under my overhead lights like a museum display nobody asked for. White paint polished enough to reflect the shelves. Brenda always drove spotless vehicles. The kind of clean that says someone else probably washes it. I looked around my garage to make sure nothing else had been moved. My father's old red Craftsman toolbox still sat against the back wall, dented on one corner from 1998 when he dropped an alternator on it and blamed gravity for 3 weeks. The wood workbench still had burn marks from soldering jobs. Everything looked normal except for one thing. Somebody had treated the room like it belonged to the neighborhood. That bothered me more than the vehicle. People think garages are where men hide from life. Mine was where I rebuilt mine. 3 years earlier, my divorce had finalized on a Thursday. Funny how life likes Thursdays. No dramatic betrayal. No screaming. Just two adults realizing they had become strangers and signing paperwork under fluorescent lights. She kept the bigger house because she wanted stability. I kept my tools because I needed purpose. I bought this place in Cedar Ridge Estates because it had one thing I cared about: an oversized 2-car garage with an insulated door and enough outlets for real work. The first night I moved in, I sat on an upside-down bucket eating grocery store rotisserie chicken and listening to rain hit the garage roof. It felt quiet in a way I had forgotten existed. That room became routine. Saturday mornings meant coffee, old rock radio, and projects. Sometimes I repaired appliances. Sometimes I restored furniture. Sometimes I just cleaned sockets while thinking through life. My father taught me every practical thing I know in space is exactly like that. Measure twice. Label everything. Never borrow what you cannot replace. And his favorite rule: private property is not about money. It is about respect. He grew up without much and treated ownership like trust. If somebody let you into their garage, that meant something. So standing there looking at that SUV, I realized this was never about parking. Brenda did not need space. Her driveway was enormous. The community center lot had 30 empty spots. This was something else. This was somebody deciding boundaries were optional if they sounded official enough. I opened my security app and checked overnight footage. There she was at 10:43 p.m. walking confidently up my driveway carrying a clipboard and talking to somebody off camera. Then maintenance opened my garage using a universal access remote. No hesitation. No emergency. They pulled the Escalade inside. Brenda pointed at my shelves. They laughed. Then she taped the notice onto the windshield and walked away. Total time inside my property: 6 minutes and 14 seconds. I exported the footage. Saved 3 backups. Uploaded 1 to cloud storage. Then I checked HOA bylaws. Nothing. No overflow authority. No garage access clause. No temporary use policy. I checked county property regulations. Nothing. I checked my garage smart opener logs. Door opened at 10:41 p.m., closed at 10:49 p.m. Then me at 6:23 a.m. Every timestamp lined up clean. I did not call anybody. I turned off interior lights. Armed the normal security system. Adjusted thermostat to 72 degrees. Not hot. Not cold. Exactly reasonable. Then I grabbed my suitcase. On my way out, I paused at the garage door and looked at the little red lock indicator glowing above the control panel. My father used to joke that locks only work if people believe they apply to them. I smiled, picked up my bag, locked the front door behind me, and headed to the airport. The first message arrived before my flight even boarded. Unknown number again. Vehicle access requested. Please respond. I was sitting at gate C14 with airport coffee and a stale breakfast sandwich, watching people argue quietly about carry-on sizes while my phone vibrated twice more. Then again. Then a fourth time. I did not open them. Instead, I switched my phone to airplane mode and looked out the terminal window at a line of planes moving slowly under morning sun. For the first time in weeks, I felt removed from Cedar Ridge Estates and all of its perfectly trimmed lawns and unofficial monarchies. The funny thing about people like Brenda is they assume everyone thinks about them as much as they think about themselves. I had learned that within my first month living there. The neighborhood looked nice from the outside. Stone entrance sign. Matching mailboxes. Flags on porches. Seasonal flower rotations. It photographed well. But every place has a personality once you stay long enough. Cedar Ridge had rules. Then it had Brenda. She was the kind of person who never technically raised her voice because she never believed she needed to. Tall. Blonde. Perfect posture. Expensive sneakers that had probably never touched dirt. Every conversation felt like she was approving your loan application. The first time we met, She knocked on my door carrying a welcome basket and a binder thick enough to stop small-caliber ammunition if neighborhood politics ever escalated that far. Cookies, bottled water, printed HOA guidelines tabbed by category. She smiled and said, "We are very proactive here." At the time, I thought she meant organized. I later realized she meant involved in things that were not her business. 3 days after moving in, she emailed me because my garage door stayed open for 43 minutes while I assembled shelving. A week later, she left a reminder that visible tool storage reduced community presentation. Then came notices about harmless things. A ladder visible for one afternoon. A package sitting on my porch overnight. My recycling bin angled incorrectly. Nothing serious enough to fight. Just enough to make you feel observed. I never gave her anything back. I answered politely. Fixed nothing unless it mattered to me. That seemed to bother her more than arguments would have. People like Brenda expect resistance because resistance proves they matter. Indifference drives them insane. About 6 months after I moved in, I attended an HOA meeting mostly because my neighbor Frank bribed me with barbecue. That was the first time I saw her in full performance mode. There she stood in front of a projector explaining community enhancements with the confidence of somebody presenting moon landing logistics. She had charts, parking diagrams, color-coded recommendations. At one point, she proposed creating a volunteer property optimization committee. Nobody knew what that meant. She explained it as helping residents use their spaces efficiently. Frank leaned over and whispered, "Last year she tried to regulate patio furniture angles." I laughed. Nobody else did. During open discussion, somebody asked why guest parking had become limited. Brenda answered for 15 minutes and never actually answered. That was her talent. She never sounded unreasonable. She just talked long enough that disagreeing became exhausting. Then she said something I remembered later. She smiled and said, "And used private spaces become community inefficiencies over time." At the time, people nodded because it sounded professional. Looking back, that sentence explained everything. She did not think ownership meant permission. She thought ownership meant responsibility to her standards. By the time my plane landed in Arizona, I turned my phone back on and saw 17 missed calls, 8 texts, 2 emails, 1 HOA notice marked urgent. I opened none of them. Instead, I checked my garage cameras. Exterior only. Everything looked quiet. Then around 11:12 that morning, Brenda appeared. White outfit. Clipboard. Walking straight up my driveway. She knocked. Waited. Knocked again. Looked through the front window. Then she walked to the garage and pressed the wall keypad. Nothing. Pressed again. Nothing. She stood there another 10 seconds. Crossed her arms. Looked directly at the camera. Then pulled out her phone. Even through silent footage, I knew exactly what expression she had. Not panic. Not yet. Confusion. The kind people get when they discover a rule applies to them too. By day 2, Cedar Ridge Estates had apparently become more interested in my garage than in actual life. I woke up in Sedona before sunrise to cold desert air and that strange silence you only get in places where nobody is trying to manage anyone else. Red rock outside the hotel window. Coffee that actually tasted like coffee. No notifications for about 20 minutes. Then my phone started vibrating across the nightstand like it had developed opinions. 31 unread texts. 9 missed calls. 3 emails flagged urgent. 1 voicemail. I ignored all of them and opened the camera feed instead. My driveway had become a tourist attraction. At 8:07 a.m., Brenda arrived wearing sunglasses large enough to qualify as weather equipment. She walked directly to the garage keypad again and punched numbers in with the confidence of somebody who had never seriously considered hearing the word no. Nothing. She tried again. Nothing. Then she pulled out her phone and started talking. 10 minutes later, a maintenance truck showed up. Same guy who opened my garage originally. Name tag, said Trevor. He looked uncomfortable before he even stepped out. Brenda pointed. Trevor shrugged. Brenda pointed harder. Trevor checked something on his tablet. Walked to the garage. Tried his access remote. Nothing. They stood there for a minute. Trevor said something. Brenda folded her arms. Trevor shook his head and left. That was interesting. I checked my security logs. No unauthorized access attempts succeeded. Good. Then another car pulled up. HOA vice president. Gray polo. Clipboard. They stood in my driveway talking for 15 minutes like diplomats negotiating access to a foreign nation. Around noon, something even better happened. Frank from across the street walked over holding a lawn chair and a cup of coffee. He sat at the edge of his driveway facing my house. 10 minutes later, his wife joined him. Then Mrs. Danner from 2 houses down appeared with iced tea. Nobody spoke to Brenda. Nobody interrupted. They just sat there, watching. HOA politics apparently beat cable television. At 1:14 p.m., Brenda finally knocked on my front door. Long controlled knocks. Pause. Longer knocks. Then she tried the handle. Locked. She stepped back and looked offended, like my house had personally disrespected her. Another hour passed. Then my phone rang again. I finally answered. Unknown number. Ethan, this is Brenda. Her voice was smooth, controlled, realtor voice. I said nothing. She continued. There seems to be a misunderstanding involving vehicle access. I took a sip of coffee and looked at the mountains outside my balcony. What misunderstanding? Short silence. My vehicle is temporarily inaccessible inside your property. I nodded to myself. Interesting phrasing. Not my garage. My property. I said, I am out of town. Another pause. Well, when will you return? 2 weeks. Silence. Then a tiny crack in her voice. 2 weeks. I said yes. She recovered immediately. That is not acceptable. I almost laughed. Not acceptable. Like I had submitted vacation dates for approval. I said, I did not know I needed authorization to travel. She ignored that. Ethan, this is creating a community issue. Community issue. Not trespassing. Not mistaken access. Community issue. I asked a simple question. Brenda, why is your vehicle inside my garage? Long pause. Then she gave me the answer I think she actually believed. We interpreted extended non-use as opportunity for temporary optimization. I closed my eyes. Temporary optimization. Somewhere in America, a business consultant probably felt a disturbance in the force. I asked another question. Did you ask? She answered immediately. HOA policy allows management discretion. I said, send me the policy section. Silence. Then she changed subjects. Ethan, cooperation matters in neighborhoods like this. I said okay. Then I ended the call. 10 minutes later, an email arrived. Subject line, immediate resolution request. Attached, no policy, no clause, no authorization. Just polite paragraphs explaining inconvenience and requesting remote access accommodation. I did not respond. I closed my phone and went hiking. That evening I checked cameras one more time. Brenda had returned. Alone this time. She stood in my driveway at sunset looking at the garage door. Hands on hips. Completely still. Then she walked closer and placed her hand flat against the metal for a second before turning away. And for the first time since this started, she did not look annoyed. She looked confused. Like she had finally discovered something she had forgotten existed. Boundaries. Day 4 was when the story stopped being about a vehicle and started becoming about control. I woke up early and drove north from Sedona toward Oak Creek Canyon with no plan beyond staying unavailable. Windows down. Dry air. Red cliffs catching morning sunlight. I had not realized how much mental space that neighborhood occupied until I left it. I spent years thinking peace came from fixing problems quickly. Turns out sometimes peace comes from refusing to participate in someone else's emergency. Around 9:30 a.m. my phone lit up with an email marked formal notice. That got my attention. I opened it while sitting at a roadside cafe with eggs, toast, and coffee strong enough to restart old machinery. The email came from the HOA Legal Committee. Subject line, obstruction of community operations. I read that twice. According to the letter, my failure to provide access to my property was creating administrative hardship and preventing temporary use allocation. Administrative hardship. I almost admired the creativity. There was no mention of unauthorized entry. No acknowledgement of why the vehicle was there. Just language designed to make the situation sound accidental and my response sound unreasonable. Then I reached the final paragraph. They requested immediate remote opening of my garage and warned continued refusal could result in review of homeowner cooperation standards. That one made me smile. Not because it scared me, because now everything was documented. I downloaded the email and saved it with the rest. Then I opened the camera feed. Apparently the neighborhood had evolved overnight. Frank now had 2 lawn chairs outside. Mrs. Danner brought pastries. Somebody had an umbrella. Nobody was blocking anything. Nobody was interfering. They were just there, watching. Across the street, Brenda stood near my driveway talking with 2 board members. She kept gesturing toward the garage and occasionally looking around to see who noticed. Everybody noticed. Then something happened I did not expect. Frank walked over to her, carrying a paper plate. He offered her a muffin. She stared at him. He shrugged and walked back. I laughed so hard I nearly spilled coffee. About an hour later, another maintenance truck arrived. Different crew. One guy carried a ladder for reasons nobody seemed to understand. They inspected the garage exterior, looked at the opener, checked the keypad. Then one of them pointed at the security camera and slowly backed away like he suddenly remembered employment mattered. They left. Around lunchtime, I got another call. Brenda again. This time she skipped the polite introduction. Ethan, this has gone far enough. Interesting. We had graduated from misunderstanding to enough. I asked what she meant. She took a breath. People are talking. I looked out at the canyon and said, about what? Small pause. Then she said something honest for the first time. They think I parked there without permission. I said nothing. She continued quickly. This is creating confusion. I asked, did you park there with permission? Silence. Then she pivoted. That is not the point. There it was. My father used to say whenever somebody says that is not the point, it usually is. I asked one more question. Brenda, if I parked in your garage and left for 2 weeks, what would happen? Silence. Longer this time. Then she said, that is different. I asked how. She never answered. Instead, she said she expected cooperation from residents. I thanked her for sharing and ended the call. That evening, I checked neighborhood forums out of curiosity. Somebody had posted a blurry photo of my closed garage with the caption, "Does anybody know what happened?" Comments exploded. Half the neighborhood thought I had left town accidentally. Some thought there was a security issue. One comment simply said, wait, why was her car in there? No response. Then another comment appeared from an account with no profile picture. Private property still counts when the owner is quiet. 47 likes. I closed the app and watched the sunset turn the desert orange. Back home, the garage stayed closed. The logs stayed clean. And somewhere in Cedar Ridge, for the first time in years, people had stopped asking what Brenda wanted and started asking why. By day 6, something changed. Not in my garage. Not with the vehicle. People changed. That morning, I skipped the hiking trails and stayed at the hotel with coffee and my laptop because curiosity finally outweighed discipline. I opened the neighborhood forum expecting complaints. Instead, I found something far more dangerous to people who live on authority alone. Questions. Somebody had started a thread titled Community Space Clarification. Innocent enough. First comment asked whether private garages had recently become subject to HOA use policies. Another asked where the official language could be found. Somebody else posted a screenshot of the bylaws. Then another resident highlighted the section about common areas. No mention of enclosed private property. Then somebody replied with 3 words. So whose idea? The thread exploded. I stayed quiet and watched. No posting. No defending myself. Just reading. My father had another rule. Once people start asking the right questions, do not interrupt them with answers. Around noon, Frank called. I answered because Frank was normal and normal people are rare. His first words were not hello. He said, "You have become neighborhood entertainment." I laughed. He lowered his voice and told me what had been happening. Apparently, Brenda had called an emergency board session at the clubhouse. Attendance was unusually high. Residents wanted clarification. Somebody asked directly whether entering private garages was now allowed. Brenda explained there had been a misunderstanding involving temporary accommodation and volunteer compliance measures. According to Frank, nobody understood what that meant. One resident asked whether volunteers usually carried universal garage remotes. Frank said the room got very quiet after that. Then came the interesting part. Trevor showed up. Maintenance Trevor. Same guy from the camera footage. Somebody asked him who authorized access. Frank said Trevor looked like a man reconsidering all of his career choices. He explained that he received a work request marked approved and assumed homeowner consent existed. Somebody asked if homeowner approval was attached. Trevor said no. Somebody asked if he had done this before. Trevor said not to his knowledge. Not to his knowledge. Frank paused and said, "Ethan, I think people are realizing this." Was not normal. I thanked him and ended the call. Then I did something I had not done yet. I opened every message Brenda sent. 43 texts. 8 emails. The progression was almost scientific. First came polite language. Clarification. Temporary inconvenience. Cooperation. Then concern. Then urgency. Then emotion started leaking through. One email explained that temperatures fluctuate and enclosed spaces create unnecessary risk for stored vehicles. Another suggested my prolonged absence might violate community expectations. One asked whether a trusted party could provide access. Then the latest one arrived at 8:02 that morning. Subject line, request for reasonable resolution. Inside was one sentence that finally acknowledged reality. I understand now this situation may have crossed boundaries. I read it 3 times. Not crossed. May have crossed. Like she discovered gravity might exist. I archived it with the others. Then I checked cameras. My driveway looked different. No lawn chairs today. No audience. Just Brenda standing alone near the garage. She looked tired. She was not dressed for presentation anymore. No clipboard. No sunglasses. She walked to the garage slowly and stood there. Then she pulled folded papers from a folder and slipped them under my front door. She looked around first. That detail interested me. People only look around when they care who sees them. Then she left. 2 hours later, Frank texted a photo. The papers were apology drafts. Not signed. Not delivered. Multiple versions. One started with misunderstanding. Another started with procedural error. One actually contained the phrase temporary storage event. Frank added one message underneath. She has never apologized before. I looked out at the Arizona sky and realized something. The vehicle was never the real trap. Silence was. Because arguments let people defend themselves. But silence leaves people alone with their own explanations. And explanations get ugly when everybody else starts listening. Day 8 started with rain in Arizona, which felt wrong somehow. Desert rain always sounds temporary, like the sky changed its mind halfway through. I sat under the hotel awning with coffee and opened the camera feed expecting another quiet day. Instead, I saw 3 folding tables in front of the Cedar Ridge Clubhouse. Somebody had brought donuts. Somebody else had a cooler. There were more cars than I had ever seen for an HOA meeting. I checked the community page and found a notice. Special open forum. Resident questions. No agenda listed. That was new. Normally, agendas appeared in color-coded PDFs with language nobody remembered 5 minutes later. I called Frank. He answered immediately and whispered like he was reporting from enemy territory. You accidentally started democracy. Apparently, after the emergency meeting, people began comparing stories. One resident said somebody once entered his backyard to move patio furniture for photos before an open house. Another said she received notices about decorations that technically complied with guidelines but offended aesthetic expectations. Somebody else remembered being told not to use a detached workshop because it created visual imbalance. On their own, every story sounded annoying. Together, they sounded familiar. Nobody had complained before because each person thought they were the only one. Frank said somebody finally asked the question nobody had asked out loud. Who gave permission? Around noon, I received an email from the HOA board. Not Brenda. The board. Subject line, request for documentation. Inside was a polite message asking whether I would be willing to provide any information related to recent events affecting community governance review. Governance review. That translated into somebody on the board realizing this might become their problem too. I replied for the first time since leaving. One sentence. Happy to share factual records upon return. No emotion. No accusations. Then I closed the laptop. An hour later, Frank called again. His voice sounded different. Less amused. More impressed. He told me the meeting turned strange. Brenda stood up and explained there had been confusion over optional community participation initiatives. Somebody asked whether entering a garage required permission. She said the situation was unique. Somebody asked whether there was written approval. She said documentation was incomplete. Then an older resident named Carol stood up. Frank said Carol had lived there 11 years and never spoke at meetings. Carol asked a simple question. If somebody parked in your garage, would you call it cooperation? Frank said nobody moved for a few seconds after that. Then another resident asked whether maintenance had records of access requests. Trevor apparently confirmed there was a submitted work order. That led to the next question. Who submitted it? Brenda said she did. Frank paused dramatically before saying, that was the moment. Not because she admitted entering. Because she admitted she never thought she needed permission. The room shifted. Frank said you could actually feel it. Nobody yelled. Nobody argued. People just started looking at each other. Then looking at her. There is something uncomfortable about discovering somebody has been acting like they own authority nobody gave them. I checked my cameras later that afternoon. Brenda returned to my house again. This time she did not approach the garage immediately. She stood at the end of my driveway for almost a minute. Then she walked up slowly and placed a new envelope under my front door. She stayed there a second before leaving. Frank texted me a picture later. It was not an apology this time. It was a printed letter requesting temporary access to retrieve personal property. Attached to it was something even better. A signed acknowledgement stating entry into the garage occurred without homeowner authorization and requesting voluntary accommodation. I stared at that sentence for a while. Not because I needed it, because she finally wrote the truth down. I saved the photo, closed my phone, finished my coffee, and realized something unexpected. I no longer cared about winning. The interesting part had already happened. People stopped treating authority like permission and started treating permission like permission. Day 11 arrived quietly, which made it dangerous. Big moments in movies always come with storms and speeches. Real life usually arrives in silence and calendar notifications. I had stopped checking the cameras every hour by then. The garage was not a mystery anymore. The real story had moved somewhere else. I was eating breakfast at a small place outside Sedona when Frank called with the kind of voice people use when they are trying not to sound excited. He said, "You should check your email." I opened it. Subject line, "Notice of Special Board Action." Not from Brenda. From the HOA board secretary. Inside was a short message informing residents that operational authority was temporarily redistributed pending internal review procedures. That sentence was trying very hard not to say somebody lost control. Then another email arrived. This one from Brenda directly. No greeting. No explanation. Just 4 sentences. "Ethan, I would like to resolve this privately. I acknowledge entering your garage was inappropriate. I am requesting access at your earliest convenience. Thank you for your consideration. No community language. No optimization. No cooperation standards. Just plain English." I read it once and put my phone down. I did not answer. Instead, I opened the camera feed. Brenda was standing outside my house again. No board members. No maintenance crew. No audience. Just her. She was holding a folder. She walked to the front door and slid something underneath. Then she stepped back and looked at the garage for a long time before leaving. Frank retrieved the papers later and sent photos. Inside was something I never expected to see. A draft policy proposal titled Resident Property Boundaries and Access Clarification. It explicitly prohibited entering enclosed private property without written owner consent. She had written the rule herself. That part almost made me laugh. My father would have loved that. He always said people understand fences best after walking into one. Then Frank sent another message. "Meeting tonight. Big turnout. You are topic number 1. I almost joined remotely out of curiosity, but decided against it. If I appeared, the story would become about me. Better to let it stay where it belonged." Around sunset, Frank called and put me on speaker without telling anyone. I stayed muted. Residents spoke one after another. Nobody sounded angry. That surprised me. Mostly people sounded embarrassed. One neighbor admitted she stopped using her workshop because she thought HOA had authority over interior usage. Another admitted he paid for unnecessary changes because questioning rules felt exhausting. Then Carol spoke again. She said something simple. Communities work when people volunteer trust, not when people collect it. Long silence after that. Then Brenda stood up. Frank described it later because I could not see her. She said she had allowed standards to become assumptions and assumptions to become authority. She admitted she never intended harm, but realized intent does not replace permission. Nobody clapped. Nobody attacked her. People just listened. Then the board voted to suspend discretionary enforcement practices pending review. Motion passed. Frank said the room looked more relieved than victorious. Later that night, I finally replied to Brenda's email. 1 sentence. I return in 3 days. Vehicle retrieval can happen then. She responded in under 2 minutes. Thank you. No extra words. No requests. That night I sat outside under the Arizona sky and thought about how strange the whole thing was. I never filed a complaint. Never threatened anybody. Never made speeches. I just left. And somehow that forced everyone to look directly at something they had stopped noticing. The garage stayed closed. The vehicle stayed safe. But the idea that some people can borrow authority forever without being questioned did not survive the week. 14 days later, I pulled into Cedar Ridge just after noon with desert dust still clinging to my car and the strange feeling that I had been gone for months instead of 2 weeks. Everything looked exactly the same. Same trim lawns. Same matching mailboxes. Same decorative stone sign at the entrance. But places can look identical and still feel completely different. As I turned onto my street, people noticed. Not dramatically. Nobody lined up. Nobody pointed. They just looked longer than normal. Frank gave me a slow wave from his driveway and raised a coffee cup like we had both survived something mildly ridiculous together. I parked in front of my house and sat for a second with the engine off. Quiet. Then I looked at the garage. Door closed. Lock indicator unchanged. Nothing damaged. Nothing forced. Just exactly where I left it. I stepped out and stretched. Before I even reached the front door, somebody cleared their throat. Brenda. She stood near the sidewalk holding a folder with both hands. Not clipboard posture. Not authority posture. Just standing there. She looked tired in a way expensive clothes cannot fix. She walked over and stopped a respectful distance away. Ethan. I nodded. She looked at the garage and then back at me. Thank you for coming back. Not thank you for understanding. Not thank you for cooperating. Different sentence. I said no problem. She held out the folder. Inside was a signed acknowledgement of unauthorized entry, confirmation that no damage occurred, and a copy of the proposed policy revisions approved by the board. There was also a short handwritten note. I read it once. It said, somewhere along the way I started thinking responsibility meant permission. I am working on that. No dramatic apology. Honestly, that made it feel more real. I folded the paper and put it away. She looked nervous for the first time since I had known her. Then she asked quietly, can I retrieve my vehicle? I smiled once and said sure. I walked to the garage keypad. Neighbors noticed immediately. Curtains moved. Front doors opened casually in the way people pretend is not curiosity. Frank somehow appeared holding coffee again, like this had become his official role. I entered the code. The motor hummed. The door rolled upward slowly. Sunlight stretched across concrete exactly the way it always used to. The Escalade sat inside untouched. Clean. Safe. Completely fine. The note still sat on the windshield. Nobody spoke. Brenda looked inside for a second before walking in. She opened the door, got in, started the engine, and slowly backed out. Then she stopped halfway down the driveway, rolled the window down, and said something I genuinely did not expect. Your garage looks nice. I nodded and said thanks. She left. No speech. No dramatic exit. Just drove away at normal speed. Frank walked over grinning and said, you know people expected fireworks. I looked at the garage and said, that sounds exhausting. He laughed. Then he asked the question everybody wanted answered. Why did you not just open it remotely? I looked around at the neighborhood and thought about it for a second. Then I said, because if I had solved the problem immediately, nobody would have asked why it happened. Frank stared for a second and nodded. That afternoon I cleaned the garage, put the stool back, straightened the extension cord, opened the windows. The smell of wood, machine oil, and old memories settled back into place. I hung one new thing over the workbench. Small black letters. Nothing dramatic. Just one sentence. Private does not mean hidden. It means permission matters. A month later, the HOA adopted the policy changes. Maintenance access rules changed. Volunteer authority got clarified. Meetings became shorter. Brenda stayed in the neighborhood but stepped down from discretionary enforcement. And every once in a while she drove past my house and kept going without slowing down. My father used to say respect is simple. You knock. You ask. You wait. Turns out a garage taught an entire neighborhood the same lesson.